Jacob knew that if it had been up to James alone, he would already be out of a job. But Margaret had chosen grace instead of vengeance, and somehow that made Jacob feel even worse. Mason leaned against the bar next to him, lowering his voice. "So, what are you going to do now?" Jacob exhaled shakily. "I don't know." Mason arched an eyebrow. "Dude, she gave you her card. That's not something she does for just anyone." Jacob shook his head. "Why would she even bother? I don't deserve it." Mason studied him for a moment before shrugging. "Maybe not, but you got a choice to make. You can keep sulking, or you can figure out how to be better." Jacob clenched his jaw. Mason was right. A shift in the atmosphere at Margaret's table. Dessert had arrived, but James wasn't finished addressing the situation. "You really let him off easy, Ma," he murmured, watching Jacob from across the room. Margaret dabbed at the corner of her mouth with a napkin, smiling. "And what would you have had me do? Publicly shame him? Have him fired?" James crossed his arms. "Maybe." Margaret chuckled softly. "And what would that accomplish? Would it undo what happened?" James sighed, his frustration evident. "No, but it would make you feel better," Margaret finished knowingly. James hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Margaret reached for her son's hand, squeezing it gently. "My dear boy, you are so much like your father." James smiled slightly. He wouldn't have let that slide either. Margaret's eyes twinkled. No, he wouldn't have. But he would have also recognized the power in teaching someone a lesson that sticks. James exhaled. "You think he'll actually learn from this?" Margaret glanced toward Jacob, who was still staring at her card as if it held all the answers to life's biggest questions. "Yes," she said simply. James followed her gaze. "And if he doesn't?" Margaret's smile remained, but there was a knowing sharpness in her eyes. "Then life will teach him another way." A decision is made as Jacob sat there, battling with his thoughts. Richard Lawson reappeared, his expression unreadable. "Jacob," he said firmly. Jacob jumped up, nearly knocking over his drink. "Sir?" Richard studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Mrs. Carter has asked that no action be taken against you tonight." Jacob swallowed hard. I understand." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "But let's be clear, this is your last warning. This restaurant prides itself on treating every guest with respect. If I ever hear about something like this happening again, you won't just be out of a job. You'll be out of the industry." Jacob nodded quickly. "It won't happen again, sir." Richard nodded. "Good." As he turned to walk away, Jacob suddenly found his voice. "Mr. Lawson?" Richard stopped, raising an eyebrow. Jacob took a deep breath. I want to be better." Richard said nothing at first. Then, after a moment, he simply nodded. "Then prove it." With that, he walked away, leaving Jacob standing there, heart pounding. A silent goodbye as Margaret and James stood to leave. Jacob found himself walking toward them, his legs moving before his brain could stop him. Margaret turned just as he approached. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice tight with emotion. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Really sorry." Margaret studied him carefully, then smiled. "I believe you." Jacob blinked in surprise. "You do?" She nodded. "But what matters is whether you believe you can be better." Jacob swallowed hard, then nodded. "I do." Margaret's smile deepened. "Then that's enough for now." James, standing beside her, gave Jacob one last unreadable look before nodding slightly, a silent acknowledgement that Jacob wasn't completely irredeemable. As they walked out, Jacob stood there, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. His lesson had been learned, but his real test was only just beginning. The hum of the restaurant carried on as if nothing had happened, as if Jacob hadn't just been confronted with the most humbling moment of his life. Margaret Carter and her son had left, yet their presence lingered like an echo in his mind. He replayed every second of their encounter, his dismissal of her, James's anger, Margaret's grace, and the heavy weight of the business card still in his pocket. For the rest of his shift, Jacob moved with an unusual quietness. His usual cocky swagger had disappeared, replaced by careful attentiveness. He made sure to greet every guest with sincerity, not just out of fear of being watched, but because, for the first time, he wanted to. Yet, an unsettling question gnawed at him. Would it be enough? Later that night, as Jacob clocked out, he saw Richard Lawson in his office, speaking in hushed tones with the maitre d', Charles. Something about their conversation looked serious. Mason nudged him as they passed. "You see that?" Jacob nodded. "What do you think it's about?" Mason shrugged. "Could be anything. Or..." He gave Jacob a knowing look. "Could be about you." Jacob's stomach twisted. Had Richard changed his mind? Was he about to lose his job after all? He took a deep breath, debating whether to knock on the office door and ask, but something held him back. Instead, he left the restaurant and stepped into the crisp night air, his thoughts swirling. Just as Jacob reached his car, his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize flashed on the screen. He hesitated before answering. "Hello, Jacob?" The voice on the other end was smooth, controlled, yet unmistakably familiar. "James Carter." Jacob froze. Yes." A pause. Then, "Meet me at the Carter Foundation office tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Jacob's pulse quickened. "Wait, what? Why?" "You'll see." The line went dead before Jacob could ask anything else. He stared at his phone, heart pounding. James Carter wanted to meet him? Why? The meeting that could change everything the next morning. Jacob stood outside the Carter Foundation headquarters, shifting nervously on his feet. The sleek glass building loomed over him, far more intimidating than he had expected. He almost didn't go in, almost convinced himself to turn around and leave. But something, maybe Margaret's words, maybe his own guilt, kept him rooted to the spot. With a deep breath, he pushed through the doors. The receptionist barely looked up before motioning toward an elevator. "Mr. Carter is expecting you." Jacob's nerves tightened with each floor he ascended. By the time he reached James's office, his palms were sweating. The door was already open. James sat behind a massive desk, flipping through a stack of papers. He barely glanced up, closed the door. Jacob obeyed, then stood awkwardly in front of the desk. James finally looked at him, his sharp gaze unreadable. "You know why you're here?" Jacob hesitated. "No, sir." James leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Last night, I had half a mind to make sure you never worked in another restaurant again." Jacob swallowed. "I understand, but my mother," James continued, "saw something in you. And when she sees something, I trust it." Jacob didn't know what to say. James studied him for a long moment. "Tell me, Jacob, who are you?" Jacob blinked. "What? Who are you?" James repeated. "Not just some waiter at a high-end restaurant. Not just the guy who made a mistake last night. Who are you, really?" Jacob's breath caught. No one had ever asked him that before. For the longest time, he had defined himself by his job, his paycheck, and the way he carried himself around others. But right now, all of that felt hollow. "I don't know," he admitted. James nodded slowly, as if that were the answer he expected. "Then let's find out." Jacob frowned. "What does that mean?" James slid a piece of paper across the desk. Jacob glanced down, his eyes widening. It was an offer, not for a job at a restaurant, but for a position at the Carter Foundation, that a choice that would define his future. Jacob's throat went dry. "I don't understand." James crossed his arms. "My mother believes in second chances. She thinks you have potential." Jacob gaped at him. "But I don't know anything about this kind of work." James smirked. "You didn't know anything about fine dining when you started either. You learned." Jacob stared at the offer. The salary wasn't extravagant, but it was decent. And more importantly, it was a real chance to do something meaningful. James leaned forward. "So, are you ready to prove my mother right?" Jacob felt his heart pounding. This wasn't just a job offer. This was redemption. and he had to decide whether or not he was brave enough to take it. Jacob's decision had been made. There was no going back now. As he stood outside the Carter Foundation's headquarters, his nerves were a sharp contrast to the sense of quiet determination that had taken root within him. He hadn't just signed the offer letter. He had signed up for a new life, one where he wouldn't be defined by mistakes or the person he used to be. The first few days were a blur of introductions, orientations, and self-reflection. James had placed him under the supervision of Sarah, a no-nonsense operations manager who seemed to take a special interest in keeping him on track. Jacob quickly realized that the foundation wasn't the cushy, laid-back environment he had imagined. It was demanding, fast-paced, and filled with individuals who were all there for one purpose: making a difference. But none of that mattered. Jacob's thoughts often wandered back to that one moment, when he had first looked into Margaret's eyes and realized that he was standing in the presence of someone extraordinary. Margaret had trusted him, and now the question was whether he could trust himself. A testing moment 1 week into his new position, Jacob was tasked with an important presentation to potential donors. It wasn't a small event. It was one that could bring in a substantial amount of funding to support the foundation's various projects. Sarah had placed a lot of faith in him, a faith that weighed heavily on his shoulders. As he prepared for the meeting, Jacob found himself looking at the stack of materials in front of him. Financial projections, charity initiatives, and detailed plans for expansion. For the first time in a long while, he felt the pressure of his responsibilities, and it was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The clock ticked relentlessly as the donors began to trickle into the conference room. Jacob adjusted his tie, his palms sweating. It was now or never. The door opened, and James entered with Margaret by his side. She gave him a nod of encouragement. "Ready?" James asked. Jacob nodded, though the nerves were still there, buzzing beneath the surface. As Jacob began the presentation, he was immediately hit with a wave of panic. The words were on the tip of his tongue, but they didn't seem to come out right. His voice wavered as he explained the foundation's goals, and he noticed some of the donors exchanging glances. His heart pounded. This was the moment, the very moment he feared most. Suddenly, a soft voice cut through his anxiety. "Jacob," Margaret said, her tone calm but firm. "Remember why you're here." Jacob's breath caught. He looked up and met her eyes, and for a moment, it felt as though time stood still. She was watching him, believing in him. He straightened, pushing the fear down into the pit of his stomach. He cleared his throat. "Sorry," he said, his voice steady now. "Let me start over." He looked at the presentation materials again, but this time they felt different. The words began to flow more easily, the data more natural. He told the story of the foundation's work, of the lives they had touched, of the impact they had made, of the future they were building together. When he finished, there was a long silence in the room. Jacob held his breath, waiting for the inevitable feedback. Finally, one of the donors, an older man with a sharp gaze, leaned forward. "This is impressive, Jacob." Jacob blinked, surprised. "Thank you. Not just the data," the man continued, "but the passion. You've clearly got a vision here." Another donor nodded in agreement. "I can see why the foundation chose you." Jacob's heart raced, but this time, it was a good kind of fast. He had done it. He had gotten through without failing. The turning point after the meeting, Jacob couldn't stop thinking about the moment when he had faltered in front of the donors. But instead of succumbing to self-doubt as he once would have, he recognized it as part of the growth process. He wasn't perfect, and maybe he never would be. But Margaret had shown him that being real, being human, was more important than pretending to have it all together. The next day, as Jacob sat in his office, reviewing new charity programs, he felt someone approach from behind. He turned and saw Margaret standing in the doorway, her presence as commanding as ever. "You did well," she said simply, her voice warm. Jacob looked up at her, a little taken aback. Thank you. I really appreciate that." Margaret smiled. "You're welcome. But I hope you understand that you didn't just do well for us. You did well for yourself. Jacob swallowed. I'm still not sure I deserve it. Margaret walked into the room, sitting across from him. Do you believe in second chances? He nodded hesitantly. I do now. Margaret's eyes softened. Good, because you've earned yours. But I can't make the choice for you, Jacob. That's something only you can do. He frowned. Earned it. Margaret leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. You've made mistakes. We all have. But the past is only a guide, not a prison. The real question is whether you're ready to move forward and prove that the person who you were is not the person you have to be. Jacob swallowed hard, his mind racing. I want to move forward, but sometimes I feel like I'm just not enough. Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his. You are. You just have to start believing that. The final challenge as the days passed. Jacob continued to grow within the foundation, steadily earning the respect of his colleagues. He was learning to balance humility with confidence, understanding that every challenge was a chance to prove to himself that he could be better. But deep down, he still carried the weight of his mistake. The way he had treated Margaret that fateful night at the restaurant. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he hadn't fully redeemed himself. Then, on a rainy afternoon, he received a call from Richard Lawson, the same manager who had nearly fired him. Jacob, I need to speak with you. Richard's voice came through the line, uncharacteristically cold. Jacob's stomach tightened. Of course. Is everything okay? Richard paused before responding. I need to speak with you about something important. And just like that, Jacob found himself walking toward the same restaurant where it had all started, his thoughts racing with possibilities of what Richard could want. This was it, the moment that would either cement his place in this new life or bring it all crashing down. Jacob stood outside the familiar restaurant, feeling a strange sense of anticipation in his chest. The steady drizzle of rain that had begun earlier in the afternoon only seemed to add to the weight of the moment. He had left behind a version of himself that had been full of arrogance and indifference, and now, just weeks later, he was being summoned back to the place where it all began. As he walked through the restaurant's doors, he saw Richard Lawson sitting at one of the back tables, his stern demeanor unbroken by the soft murmur of the evening crowd around him. For a moment, Jacob hesitated. Was this a confrontation, or was this a chance to finally make things right? Richard's eyes met his, and he motioned for Jacob to sit. Without a word, Jacob pulled out the chair across from Richard and sat down. The room seemed to quiet around them, as if the restaurant itself was holding its breath. Jacob, Richard began, his voice surprisingly calm, we need to talk about what happened that night. You know which night I'm referring to. Jacob felt the familiar pang of shame wash over him. He nodded silently, his hands instinctively folding on the table. I should have fired you, you know, Richard continued, his tone far less aggressive than Jacob had expected. I wanted to. You humiliated the woman and made a mockery of the restaurant standards. But Richard paused for a moment, studying Jacob. Jacob could feel the weight of the unspoken words, but he didn't interrupt. This was Richard's moment to speak, and he owed him the respect of listening. But Richard continued, I didn't. And I didn't because something changed after that night. He leaned forward. Something changed in you, Jacob. Jacob's heart skipped. I've tried to be better, he said, his voice steady. I've been working hard to turn things around, to make it right. I know I made a huge mistake, but I can't take it back. Richard studied him for a long moment. That's true, he said slowly. You can't take it back, but you've shown that you're capable of growing. That matters. Jacob blinked, surprised by the praise. It had been a long time since anyone had said anything positive about him. However, Richard continued, you'll have to show more than just growth. Jacob swallowed. He didn't know where this conversation was headed, but the unease in his stomach told him it wasn't over yet. Richard's voice hardened. The thing is, Jacob, you hurt the Carter family, especially Margaret, and that's not something I take lightly. Jacob nodded, the guilt coming back in full force. I know. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I owe her. And her son. Richard's eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. I've spoken with James Carter, and we've come to an agreement. You've earned a second chance, but there's one more thing you need to do. Jacob straightened. His curiosity piqued. What's that? Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You're going to go to Margaret, and you're going to apologize. Not just some half-hearted apology either. You need to show her that you understand the weight of what you did and that you're truly sorry. Jacob's chest tightened. I understand. Good, Richard said. Do it soon. If you want to be part of this community, you need to show that you have the humility to make things right. Jacob nodded again, his mind racing. He didn't know how to go about doing this, but he understood one thing. This was his last chance to prove he had changed. A heartfelt apology, it wasn't easy. The next day, Jacob found himself standing in front of the large, elegant Carter residence. The address felt surreal, as though he had crossed into another world. A world far removed from the one he had come from. The grand front door loomed before him, a symbol of everything he had once taken for granted. He rang the doorbell, his heart pounding in his chest. After a few moments, the door opened, and there stood James Carter, looking more serious than ever. Jacob, James said, his eyes scanning him for any sign of insincerity. You've come. I have, Jacob replied, his voice quieter than he intended. I need to speak with your mother. James nodded and stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. She's in the living room. She's expecting you. Jacob walked into the house, his footsteps echoing on the polished floors. The opulence of the home only deepened the sense of shame he felt in his chest. This wasn't just about the apology. It was about acknowledging his own lack of understanding, his own shortcomings. Margaret sat by the window, a soft smile on her face when she looked up to see Jacob enter. Her gaze was warm, yet there was an undeniable heaviness in her eyes. Jacob, she said, her voice steady but not without a hint of weariness. I didn't think I'd see you again. Jacob hesitated before sitting down across from her, his hands trembling. He had expected this moment to be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated how emotionally charged it would be. I know you didn't, Jacob began, his voice quiet but earnest. I didn't deserve to be in your presence after what I did. I can't take back how I treated you that night. Margaret's eyes softened as she nodded. You were wrong, Jacob, but I think you know that now. I do, he replied, and that's why I'm here, to apologize, to tell you that I'm sorry, from the bottom of my heart. What I did was unforgivable, but I hope that one day you can see that I'm not the person I was. Margaret watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. Jacob felt the silence stretching on, unsure of what to say next. But then Margaret spoke. You've taken the first step, Jacob, she said softly. It's not about asking for forgiveness right away. It's about showing that you're willing to change. And from what I've seen, you are. Jacob's chest tightened with emotion. I'll keep showing you. I promise. I'm not perfect, but I'm working to be someone I can be proud of. Margaret smiled just slightly, as if sensing the sincerity behind his words. That's all I need to hear. A bridge between the past and the future. Jacob left the Carter residence with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He had faced the person he had wronged most, and he had done the hardest thing he could. He had asked for forgiveness. It wasn't an immediate resolution, but it was a start. He had taken responsibility for his actions, and in doing so, he had opened the door to a future where he could be more than his past mistakes. And while Jacob still had a long way to go, there was something different about him now, something that would allow him to truly move forward. As the sun set over the horizon, Jacob looked back toward the Carter Foundation, his new place of work, the place where he had been given a second chance. The world felt a little more forgiving now, and he was ready to prove that he deserved it. The weeks that followed Jacob's heartfelt apology to Margaret were a whirlwind of personal growth and newfound understanding. The restaurant, now a distant memory in his past, seemed like another life entirely. Jacob had truly changed, though the journey hadn't been easy. It was a process, each day another opportunity to prove to himself and to those around him that he was not the man who had once dismissed an elderly woman, not the man who had lived in blind arrogance. Margaret, for her part, had accepted Jacob's apology, not with grand gestures or immediate warmth, but with a quiet understanding that spoke volumes. She had seen his sincerity and had given him the space to prove his intentions through action, not just words. Slowly, the walls between them began to melt, and in their place, a mutual respect and understanding started to grow. Jacob had immersed himself in the work at the Carter Foundation with a sense of purpose he had never known before. No longer driven by the need for recognition or validation, he worked tirelessly, focusing on the mission of the organization and the people it helped. He found fulfillment in helping others, in seeing the direct impact his efforts had on families, on communities, on lives. It was the kind of work that kept him awake at night, not out of anxiety, but out of passion. One afternoon, as Jacob sat in his office, reviewing reports and proposals, there was a knock at the door. He looked up to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable but not unfriendly. "Jacob," she said, "I've been thinking." Jacob put down the papers and turned toward her, giving her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" Margaret stepped inside, her hands folded in front of her as if holding a decision in her palms. "You've been doing exceptional work here," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I've been watching, and I think it's time we talk about a new opportunity." Jacob's heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He had grown accustomed to the work he was doing, but the idea of a new opportunity made him both excited and nervous. "What kind of opportunity?" he asked cautiously. Margaret gave a small smile, the kind of smile that suggested she already knew the answer. "We've been considering promoting you to a more senior role, one that would give you more responsibility and a wider reach. But I need to know that this is something you're ready for. This is about more than just your ability to do the job. It's about leadership, vision, and integrity. Are you ready for that?" Jacob swallowed hard. The weight of her words settled in, and for a moment, he let the significance of the question sink in. This wasn't just about a promotion. It was a test of everything he had worked to become. "I think I am," Jacob said after a long pause, his voice firm with conviction. "I'm ready to take the next step, and I'm ready to keep proving that I can be the person I want to be." Margaret nodded, her eyes gleaming with approval. "I believe you, Jacob. You've shown me that you understand what it means to be a part of something bigger than yourself. You've earned this." The words filled him with a profound sense of gratitude. But more than that, they reaffirmed a lesson that had been ingrained in him over the past few months. Redemption was not a one-time event. It was an ongoing process, one that required commitment, humility, and a willingness to learn and grow. Later that evening, after the workday had ended, Jacob found himself standing outside the Carter Foundation headquarters, looking up at the building with a sense of wonder. The night was clear, the city lights sparkling in the distance. He thought back to the man he had once been, lost, arrogant, and blind to the people who mattered most. But now, as he stood there, he realized that every moment of struggle, every ounce of effort he had poured into changing himself, had been worth it. The future was no longer a source of anxiety, but a canvas waiting to be filled. And this time, he would make sure to paint it with the right colors. As he turned to leave, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Margaret, her presence as calming as ever. "You're doing good work," she said with a small smile, her voice carrying a quiet pride. "But remember, Jacob, this is only the beginning. Keep pushing, keep learning, and never forget where you came from." Jacob looked at her, grateful for her guidance, for her belief in him. "I won't forget," he said softly. "I promise." A full circle months passed, and Jacob continued to rise through the ranks of the Carter Foundation. His success was no longer measured by the accolades he received, but by the people whose lives were touched by his work. He had become a leader, not in the conventional sense of titles and status, but in the way he inspired others to be better, to do better, and to believe in the possibility of change. As for Margaret, her influence on Jacob was undeniable. She had shown him that true leadership was not about asserting control or power. It was about lifting others up, about using your platform to make a difference. She had forgiven him. Yes, but more importantly, she had given him the space to redeem himself and the tools to do so. Jacob's relationship with her grew stronger, no longer defined by the tension of the past, but by a mutual respect that transcended everything. There were still moments when Jacob would look back on that fateful night, the night he had treated Margaret with such cruelty, but instead of regret, he saw it as the turning point that had led him to where he was now. He had done the work. He had learned the lessons. And now, as he stood on the precipice of a new chapter, Jacob knew that his story wasn't just about redemption. It was about growth, resilience, and the quiet strength of second chances. In the end, the story of the waiter and the elderly black woman was not just a tale of an unfortunate incident or a shocking revelation. It was a story about the power of change, of humility, and of the possibility for anyone, no matter their past, to find their way to a better future. And as Jacob looked toward the horizon, he knew that the journey had only just begun.